Finally, we made it to the promised lands of the positive tiers. I don't think I need to do that much explaining on how these last few tiers work, but basically, anything from here on out is what I consider to be a good boss fight. That doesn't mean that I think that these fights don't have flaws, because they definitely do, they just manage to transcend those flaws and end up being good fights regardless. With the good tiers specifically, there'll be several fights that might have some pretty major flaws with them, but with good movesets and presentation, they manage to still leave me satisfied thinking that was a fun fight overall, and I would not mind doing it again. With that out of the way, let's get started with the good tier. First up in the good tier, we have Lady Butterfly. Like I said in the intro to this tier, this is a good fight. It teaches you early on how to use both items and shinobi tools in order to make fights easier. But even then, the fights are more than doable without them. The main thing that drags the fight down for me is the lack of direct engagement and the utilization of ads. Let me explain. I do find this fight fun, but my main problem is that for the majority of the fight, you aren't even fighting Lady Butterfly herself. She's either jumping around in a little robe while you try to snipe her with one of your shurikens, or she's just summoning ads and piecing out while you deal with them. To be fair, both of these mechanics do have counters to them in form of shurikens and snap seeds respectively, but even with these I find it to be tedious. But still, there being easily accessible counters for the annoying mechanics is more than good enough to carry the fight to the good tier, though not very far into it. Yep, absolutely no bias with this placement. Aldrich's character design had nothing to do with where I placed him in the ranking, none at all. But on a serious note, a decent amount of reason I do place Aldrich so high is both their lore and their location. Aldrich is probably the Lord of the Cinder with the most expansive but at the same time vague lore, making them one of the most interesting fights to read about. Obviously, there is also their connection to a certain other character, cough cough wink wink. The fight itself has to be a bit more hesitant though. I think this is one of the fights in the entire tier where what RNG you get will heavily influence how fun you think it is. If he is nice and ends up spamming melee attacks and his bigger beam attack, then the fight is quite fun. You get to actively fight him one-on-one while dodging attacks and weaving in R1s. But if you get unlucky and he's constantly teleporting and using his arrow attack, it is one of the most boring fights in Dark Souls 3. Though I would like to add that I think that the recorporation of Gwyndolin's attacks from his original fight was extremely well done and adds a lot to the fight if you have fought him before. We finally get to the Dark Souls 2 bosses that I actually like, and ironically enough, the first one is yet another humanoid. But at least this one has a maze. I think the number one reason that I like Velstadt is that he's one of the first bosses in the entire game that doesn't feel slow. I don't know what happened between Velstadt and the past humanoid bosses, but they totally nailed the pacing. He feels like the perfect speed, giving the fight the special flow that most Dark Souls 2 fights simply don't have. There are some negatives though. First are his magic attacks. While I do like that he has magic attacks to spice up his movesets, the hitboxes for his magic attacks are straight up just bad. This is especially noticeable seeing how Dark Souls 2 is usually known for having really well done hitboxes. The glancing problem really rears its ugly head in this fight. I'm honestly not sure why myself, but for some reason Velstadt just hits cleansing blows after cleansing blow on me the entire fight, despite it not being an issue for any other boss for a lot of hours at this point. I don't know if this is because his weapon is so big or his hitboxes in general are just bad, but it was really hard to ignore on this one. Lastly, and this one isn't all that bad, but I would have really liked to see his power up move being significantly shorter. It's just almost comical how long he just kinda sits there and lets you hit him. You can easily do up to a third of his total HP during this, making what is otherwise a fairly challenging fight way too easy. That might have seemed like a lot of negatives. Despite all that, he still manages to climb his way into the good tier, which I think says a lot about his general gameplay and flow. If only all the humanoid voices were this good. Well, now that we're in the good tier, we're finally going to be seeing some Bloodborne bosses again, and first up, we have the Bloodstarved Beast. To be honest, there isn't really anything that interesting about the Bloodstarved Beast. He's just yet another beast type boss. Already see plenty of these on the list. Most of the reason I rate this boss so highly is that it's Bloodborne. Bloodborne's combat just really enables this type of fight to really shine. Instead of having to be cautious and keeping your distance from beast type enemies, as they love to flail and be unpredictable, in Bloodborne you can always be playing aggressive and in their face. On top of this, you also have the blood cocktails that you can use to distract the beast to get in some free hits, and you have a boss that really caters to every level of player. Gundyr is a weird one. Initially when I think of him, it's just positive things that come to mind, but as I think more and I get reminded that phase 2 exists, my opinion kinda drops. I really do like its first phase. If I was rating him purely off of his first phase, I probably would rate him a tier higher than he currently is. But like I said, I'm just not a fan of his second phase. While I do understand that it's there to teach players about phase shifts and show them that the pus of man exists, I just don't think that is very well done. It's hard to see what he's doing. He's very wild and unpredictable, something that's quite hard for a new player to deal with. Overall, I do think that he's a good tutorial boss. I just wish that I had done his second phase a bit better. So overall, I still need to place him in low good tier, even if it pains me. The Pursuer keeps up the trend of each game having a fantastic set of two first bosses. While the last giant suffered from his simple moveset, the Pursuer shines despite it. Technically, all of his attacks are just him swinging his sword, but I still managed to make them all unique and actually fun to play against. The Pursuer is the first humanoid boss that you fight in Dark Souls 2, and honestly sets the bar really high for the rest to come. This honestly might be partly to blame by so many of the humanoid bosses in Dark Souls 2 feel so lackluster. By the way, it's a boss in Dark Souls 2 who isn't humanoid, or at least not completely. Najka is a bit of a weird one though. She's a bit of a mix between a proper fight and a gimmick fight. I say this because she does have a gimmick where she burrows into the ground, and you can lead her to collide with solid objects to stun her for a few seconds. Well, it does sound simple, and it is, but only if you know about it. It is honestly quite hard to figure out on your own, and even if you happen to do it by accident, there isn't really all that much visual feedback that implies that you have successfully done a mechanic. This is more or less of a nitpick though. Overall, I think Najka is a very refreshing boss. She has quite a distinct moveset that isn't really close to any other boss in the game. She has a healthy mix of fast and slow attacks, and even some magic attacks, though these are a bit more hit or miss. There's even a mini NPC storyline revolving around her in the area, but for her that adds a fair amount to the fight, even if you happen to stumble upon it. It's honestly hard to express just how nice this fight was after slugging through 8 consecutive mediocre or just straight bad fights before it. Thank you, Najka. You truly saved my mental that day. Let me get to what I guess is the first fight of Bloodborne, and honestly, I think Bloodborne has the best two first fights of any of the games. You really get a good mix, one being a giant beast type enemy and the other being a more standard humanoid enemy, but we'll get to the human. For now we'll talk about the beast. Cleric Beast is a pretty fantastic introduction to Bloodborne's combat system. If you decide to play it safe and keep your distance, Cleric Beast will very quickly punish you, and you will most likely die. It's only when you decide to go close and play aggressively that you'll start to see some real progress, something that gets beat into you over and over again throughout the game, but this is a pretty fantastic introduction to it. On top of that, Cleric Beast also teaches you several other mechanics, such as some enemies are weak to guns, even if you don't counter them if you shoot them in certain spots. It can also teach you that beasts, surprisingly enough, aren't huge fans of fire, so using Molotovs against them is pretty effective. And honestly, I can go on. Cleric Beast teaches you a lot of different things depending on how you approach him. No wonder Bloodborne is the best one in the series. No bias though, of course. Quelaag is some of the best Dark Souls 1 has to offer. It's a perfectly balance between great storytelling and a fantastic fight. Like with all other bosses, I won't really be going into the lore, but I would heavily recommend that you do if you aren't familiar. I'm just going to say that it is fantastic. As far as the fight goes, it's also fantastic. Quelaag's special mechanic is crowd control, which she does by spewing lava on the ground, forcing you away from certain points in the boss room, and controlling your movements to some extent. On top of this, she has a very solid moveset that has a good mix of slower and readable attacks, and ones that you learn as you go. Quelaag acts as a checkpoint from the easier early game, as she has a significant increase in difficulty from what comes before her. It only gets harder after this. There's no wonder that she's a fan favourite. I very much deserve her spot in the good tier. Elemer is what I previously referred to as a filler boss, though when it comes to Elden Ring, it's a bit harder to refer to them as that. He's quite a unique moveset for just being some random dude you can meet in the overworld. I do admit I like it when they do have humanoid enemies with sword, but with a twist that spices them up a bit, and Elemer's weird spinny sword definitely does that. His moveset is quite solid, pretty much up to par with the rest of the game's high average quality. Only complaint I really have for him is that he's a bit too simple. He doesn't have enough moves or HP, making his fight pretty short. It would be cool to see a powered up version of him with more moves in the future. Here's hoping the DLC delivers. Vordt, much like the rest of the second bosses in the series, is a banger. There isn't even really anything that special about him. He does have his rush phase, which isn't used all that often for humanoid enemies like him. There's just something about him as a whole that's just fun to fight. It's just one of those fights where it flows perfectly and you just have fun. I feel like most veterans that fought him before just kind of get what I mean. Even though there's obviously still a long way to the top, there isn't anything I would change about Vordt. He's perfect for the stage of the game he's in, and that's fine. Not every boss needs to be some S tier boss, though Vordt is S tier in my heart. Paarl is in many ways the same as the Bloodstarved Beast. Maybe not literally, but both are beast type enemies that don't really have any obvious flaws in their movesets. Paarl flows really well and is for the most part a fun fight. Where he falls a bit short is that he's pretty forgettable. It might not be something that you're necessarily thinking about as you're fighting him at the time, but as time goes on and you fight more bosses, you'll start to see where he falls a bit short. One of these things is his unique aspect being his lightning moves, that doesn't really affect the fight all that much, and you might not even remember that he has lightning moves at all if it's been a while. That's if you remember him at all, really. Though I'm ragging on the poor boy a lot, the reason why I rate him so high is that the time of fighting, he's challenging but fun, even if your memories of him don't age that well. Personally, I find Vicar Amelia to be to Bloodborne what Quelaag is to Dark Souls 1. She acts as a checkpoint that divides the early game and the mid game, though Vicar Amelia might be a bit more obvious as the world literally changes when you beat her. Gameplay wise, I find her to be sort of the culmination of all the beast fights that I've fought so far. She's the ultimate test for you as a hunter to make sure that you're ready for the night that is to come. I don't really have anything negative about the fight. The only thing I can think of is that she maybe has a bit too much HP, and I wouldn't mind if it was slightly lower, or maybe a bit more damage to compensate. Kalameet might be the boss that benefited the most from me replaying the entire series for this video. Before I played Dark Souls 1 again, I genuinely hated Kalameet, and I would actively avoid fighting him whenever I did additional playthroughs. But after forcing myself to fight him this time, since I needed some footage, my opinion of him skyrocketed. First, the lead up to his fight is some of the best in the series, meeting him on the bridge and then later on in his arena where he just cooks you. But the cutscene where Go shoots him down, cinematic masterpiece. Fight-wise, I think he's the best dragon FromSoft has ever made. He still has a lot of the same bullshit as a lot of other dragons has, like the charge attack with no tell and constant micro stutters around his legs. There's just something about Kalameet. He just feels more intelligent than the other dragons you fight. Most other dragons still feel like you're fighting an animal. They are wild and they thrash around a bunch, but Kalameet is more of a humanoid fight, but in dragon form, if that makes any sense. It's probably not. Basically, except for those two examples earlier, I don't think there are any problems with Kalameet's moveset. He's just straight up a good and enjoyable fight. Even though you might have struggled with him in the past, I urge you to go back and give him another try. It might just be because I play more Souls games afterwards that he feels this way. I'd be interested to hear if any of you can relate to this. Next up we have the Forgotten Child of Dark Souls 3 DLC, and honestly, I think it's a bit of a shame. Champion Gravetender and Champion Wolf is another really solid duo fight, and yet again, it's because you don't actually have to deal with both of them at the same time for all that long. Much like Gargoyles, the second boss doesn't appear before you get the first boss to half HP. Thing is, the first boss in this fight is an NPC boss, meaning that stun knocking them and rushing them down is very simple. He does come with two smaller wolves to help him out a bit, but you can easily bait them out and then just one-shot them. The reason why I don't really mind that he's easy to kill fast is that the fight doesn't really start until the wolf appears anyways. The wolf genuinely has one of the most fun movesets in the entire game to play against. You're both constantly weaving in and out, trading blows and dodging. Normally I'd find bosses that rush away from you boring as you have to wait, or sprint after them until you can do anything, but that isn't a problem in this fight, as the wolf would always rush right back to you. The fight might be mechanically simple and have little to no lore, but at the very least I thoroughly enjoyed fighting them, which is honestly not something I can say about half the fights on this list. Shadows of Yharnam is one of the best fights between more than two enemies in the entire game. As for previous fights, I think a lot of this comes from the combat in Bloodborne. Its more aggressive and faster paced combat makes it much easier to weave in and out to find openings against multiple enemies. The enemies themselves are also really well balanced and is one of the few fights where they were very obviously designed with each other in mind. They are all unique, making it so they play around each other really well. They don't tend to overlap attacks all that often. They are also different in playstyle, making it easier to focus down one specific one, no matter which are alive. There are even mechanics where you kill a few that makes the fight harder to compensate, giving the fight a really nice difficulty curve. I really wish that this was the standard that FromSoft always had for multi-fights, but other than one single fight that is a bit further up the list, I don't think they've ever really reached this quality again. Just like the previous fight, this is another fight that I think is carried quite a bit by the game it's in. I think that overall, Dragonslayer Armour is pretty comparable to a lot of bosses in Dark Souls 2. His moveset is overall very slow and easy to read, but punishing when you do get hit. He has an added mechanic that just doesn't really matter, as you can for the most part just ignore it. And most obviously, he's yet another humanoid, though at least his weapon is pretty unique. All this adds up to what I would consider a fairly bog standard fight, but what carries it and makes it better than all the fights below it is that it's in Dark Souls 3. As the last game in the Souls trilogy, it has by far the most polished combat system out of the three. This makes fighting what are otherwise pretty standard bosses feel much more satisfying. Because of this, I can't really put the fight with the others that I think are technically pretty comparable. Maybe in the future, whenever Dark Souls 1 and 2 get remakes, and I inevitably have to do a redo of this entire video. This is probably another fight that I rate higher than the average. I'm not even 100% sure myself why I like this fight as much as I do. It's just one of those fights that I think has a really good flow to it. There aren't really any attacks that I think are problematic or annoying to play against. Her special mechanic where she darkens the arena and starts walking slowly towards you while flailing all her limbs is stressful and takes a bit of getting used to, but it's fun to play against and it looks pretty cool. Overall, I think it's just a well done fight with not a lot of flaws and a pretty good flow. Maybe I'll change my mind whenever Sony finally decides to remake Bloodborne. I guess we'll see. Rennala is probably the best caster fight that FromSoft has ever done, something that they have struggled with in the past. She has two very different faces that play completely different to one another, both of these being improved versions of previous fights in the series. Her first face is mostly just a gimmick fight, we have to kill specific ads that are singing in order to make Rennala vulnerable. Think Deacons of the Deep, but not shit. I think that the singing aspect adds a lot to the fight, in both atmosphere and gameplay, as you can use the singing to locate where the ad is. When you empty her health bar in phase 1, you're transported to probably one of the most stunning boss arenas in any FromSoft game. This is where I think the fight turns into a better version of Alana. Much like Alana, Rennala is another spellcaster who will try to keep a distance from you while spawning ads for you to deal with. Where the two differ is that Rennala has a much more interesting arsenal of both ads and spells that she can use throughout the fight. She has a total of 4 ads that she can spawn, instead of just 2. She will also despawn and respawn her ads much more frequently than Alana. All this makes the fight way less frustrating. Gameplay wise, I still don't think this is the best that FromSoft can do with a caster fight, as it's still very much carried by other factors such as character design and the arena, but it is a pretty major step up from the previous ones. Darklurker is such a weird boss. It's really hard to get to, where you have to complete a long ass questline to even get to attempt the fight. And it's honestly a shame, as it is one of the most unique and fun fights in the entire game. The best fight in the game if you don't count any DLC. At first, you'd think that I would hate the Darklurker. He's a caster and a duo fight. Well, the easiest way to explain why I think it is a good fight would be to explain its main mechanic. Basically, when you get Darklurker to about half HP, he'll split himself into 2. From here, the fight drastically changes as you have to deal with 2 of them instead. This is another example of a fight where you have to fight several enemies that were very obviously designed with each other in mind, as they have several attacks that directly involve both. For example, they'll sometimes shoot attacks at each other where the receiving Darklurker will create a portal and redirect the attack towards you, so you have to figure out where the attack will eventually come from. There is a lot to keep in mind during this fight, but it never gets to the point where it's frustrating. It's honestly a shame that this fight is as hidden as it is, and that it's in Dark Souls 2. If it was done in Dark Souls 3 and given the attention that I think it deserves, I think it could be one of the best fights in the entire series. As it stands, it's a really good concept, but they simply just don't do enough with it for it to be any higher on the list than it is. But it's still a really good fight that I enjoyed a lot. Ebrietas is for the most part a very well done big boss. She's a very moveset, but she'll use most of her limbs to attack. She's for the most part slow, but she has some faster attacks weaved in there to keep you paying attention. What she starts to feel lacking is that she suffers from the same thing a lot of bigger bosses do. Even though it feels like the fight is designed around being in front of her, it's actually the worst place to be. By simply hugging her side, you'll just kinda end up dodging a lot of her attacks without really doing anything. I do feel like a lot of new players don't know about this, so they don't actually do it. And if you self-impose a rule not to do this in the fight, it's actually a pretty challenging one. Obviously, it is a flaw with the fight, but it's at least that one that you have to choose to exploit, so I won't hold it against it too much. So other than this, I find it to be one of the most enjoyable fights against larger monsters. Her design also helps with this, as she's one of the most unique designs in the series, truly looking like something straight out of a Lovecraft book, and I'm all for it. While I think that Rennala is one of the best caster fights they've done, I think that Loretta is the absolute best one. Loretta is a unique boss. Not only that she's a caster boss, but she's also one of the few mounted bosses. The decision to give her a mount was honestly pretty genius. Most of the time, FromSoft's solution to caster bosses was just to simply give them a beefy frontline, like Velstadt for Alana or the Spirit Summons for Rennala. Though they didn't need that for Loretta, as she has her horse. This both makes her a lot tankier than the previous bosses and gives her the ability to keep a distance. Despite this, she doesn't run away all that often. She'll sometimes create distance, but this doesn't take long for you to close. Loretta has a good combination of melee and ranged magic attacks that she uses against you, which I think is another crucial part of why she works as well as she does. While most other caster bosses are primarily only ranged, Loretta can actually go toe to toe with you even in melee range. None of her attacks are annoying to deal with, and it all culminates in a good moveset that has good flow to it. Loretta was honestly one of the most surprising fights in the game, as I didn't expect it to be anywhere near as fun as it ended up being. Only real complaint I have about the fight is that it isn't really all that hard. I feel like most probably beat her on the first or second try. With a bit more oomph to her, I think she could have climbed a bit more, but I'm still very satisfied with what we got. Moon Presence is another weird one. Overall, I think Moon Presence is a good fight, but I still find it to be a disappointing fight, so let me explain. If you didn't know, Moon Presence is the hidden final boss of Bloodborne. But doing a bunch of random stuff in the game, you can unlock this extra fight after what is technically the last boss. The main reason I'm disappointed with this fight is that it's just a worse fight than the actual original final boss. I won't really go into much depth about that boss as he's a bit higher on the list. Though I do say that I find Moon Presence disappointing, I still think it's a good fight. Moon Presence is technically a larger boss, but because of his thin body, he doesn't really feel like one. His moveset is overall fine, with no obvious bad attacks. He does have a unique mechanic that falls a bit flat. He'll every now and then do a scream that will put you to 1 HP. On paper, it sounds like a decent mechanic, but the problem is that it's way too easy to deal with. After he does the scream, he's stunned for several seconds, so all you have to do is just walk up to him and hit him a few times, and you'll get most of, if not all of your HP back, and get to do a bunch of damage to the boss at the same time. Somehow the attack where he puts you to 1 HP is the one that you want to get more often, as it's just free damage for you. I think with some added mechanics, it could be a cool attack, but as it stands, it's just not very good. The greatest strength of the Moon Presence is definitely his design. He looks really cool, and unlike anything else in the game. This coupled with his opening cutscene and animation, he's quite an intimidating boss. I only wish that his fight reflected this more. This is specifically for the first time you fight Owl. This doesn't take into account the second fight at all. Owl is a very peculiar fight. He's one of the only bosses in the entire series that will actually fight dirty. Usually Souls fights are very centered on everything being fair and balanced, and is a lot of the reason why the Souls series is as beloved as it is. But Owl breaks that. He will at several times in the battle fight dirty. Sometimes he'll pretend to surrender and attack you, or use smoke to obscure where he is, and sometimes he'll even completely stop you from healing. I think this is a really interesting concept, and my only complaint is that I don't think they went far enough with it. I think this is one of those fights where they could have done some more meta things to trick the player. Maybe have him pretend to be hurt and show his health bar as lower than it actually is, or maybe give him some of the same tools that the player has. I do understand there's a very thin line between cool and enjoyable and just straight up frustrating mechanics when it comes to this type of thing. But with Souls of all things, I don't think I would have minded added mechanics that are a bit frustrating. Other than this, Owl has a varied and interesting moveset. His sourcings are slow but punishing, and with the mix of previously mentioned tricks he plays, he ends up being one of the most memorable fights in the entire game. If I were to criticize it in any way, it would be my usual one, that the boss simply being too easy. I beat him on my first try on my first playthrough, which I thought was a bit of a shame, though I suppose this might be because he does have a harder fight later on. You might remember roughly 10 hours early in the video that I mentioned there was a better version of the Yharnam fight, and this is it. Rykard is essentially the same type of gimmick fight as Yharnam, just done much better. In the Rykard fight, the special weapon you use is right in front of you as you pass through the floodgate, instead of just being at the opposite end of the room. For the Rykard fight, all of the attacks are unique instead of just the weapon art, giving you a lot more freedom in the fight. This also makes the fight feel a lot more standard from FromSoft instead of just a gimmick. By giving you a full weapon instead of just a weapon art, they also had the option to fully flesh out the boss, which they definitely did with Rykard. Yharnam for the most part only had 2 or 3 attacks that we would use against you. Meanwhile, Rykard has 2 phases, both with their own unique moveset. I honestly don't have much to say about the first phase. It's a fairly easy stage, and I feel like it's mostly just there to get you used to your new weapon and what it can do. Where the fight really gets interesting is when you get phase 2, and Rykard fully reveals himself. Instead of just fighting a snake, you're now fighting a giant boss with a sword. This also gives him a completely new moveset for you to learn, while still borrowing a few attacks from phase 1. Phase 2 is also where most of my complaints about the fight come from. While I think that Rykard is overall a good fight, there are quite a few problems with the second phase. Firstly, he really likes to move towards you. This isn't really that much of a problem until he manages to back you into a corner. You wouldn't think this would happen all that often with how big his arena is, but it happened to me almost every single time I fought him. This could have easily been fixed by simply making the arena bigger, and I don't really see a reason why they didn't just do this. Secondly, towards the end of his second phase, the fight really devolves into a complete shitshow. There's a bunch of different spells that have lingering effects and last for a while. This comes with the fact that he starts to rain down about 1 million meteors, and there isn't really a single person on this planet that can tell what is actually going on. Your best bet for when this happens is just spam dodge and pray that you don't die. This can make the fight pretty frustrating overall, as it just feels like it's out of your control, and the only reason I don't really mind it that much myself is that it's a great spectacle. This fits in quite well with the fact that it's a gimmick fight, and therefore isn't really meant to be much like other fights in the series. If they turned down how much of a shitshow his second phase is, I think Rykard is the best gimmick fight, and one of the best spectacle fights in the entire series. Now, if you've ever done a soul level 1 run of Dark Souls 3, then you can probably just skip past this entire entry, as you'll disagree with this placement quite a bit. But seeing how I have never done a soul level 1 run myself, I actually really like this fight. To explain this to people that don't know, I'll have to get into his moveset, so let's start. Oceiros has 2 phases. They start off very passive with a lot of slow moves. This is because he's holding Ocelot, his son, in his arm as he fights. He will also constantly be talking to Ocelot throughout the fight. There isn't really much to say about his first phase. It's just a mediocre fight. Where the real fun starts is when you get to him to half health. He'll get very frustrated and slam Ocelot into the ground, supposedly killing him. For the rest of the fight, Oceiros is now enraged. All his attacks become a lot more feral and unpredictable. He starts doing a lot more standard dragon attacks like breath attacks and charges. And this is where all the people who have done soul level 1 runs will get PTSD. See, Oceiros has the standard dragon rush, and like with most other dragons, he doesn't have a startup animation. This honestly isn't that much of a problem in normal playthroughs, as you can easily tank through the damage, but if you're doing a soul level 1 run, you simply don't have the HP to tank it, and he'll just one-shot you. Other than this though, I don't really have any problems with the moveset at all. It's generally very fast, and has a very good flow to it. Oceiros is honestly just a blast to fight. Despite not being all that hard, he is still one of the most fun fights in the entire game. Some part of me wishes they had some sort of third phase to make up for him losing so much HP during the first phase. Without it, he just ends up being a bit too easy, as you get to chunk him to pretty much half for free. With some sort of healing mechanic or a phase 3, he'd probably move up an entire tier, but as it stands, he's sitting comfortably at the top of the good tier. Astel is one of those rare big bosses where standing in front of him is actually the best way of fighting him, and that's probably my favourite part about him. Astel has a pretty smart design, but they mix in big AoE attacks that go around his entire body. This pretty much forces you to play in front of him to give you enough time to actually make it away in time. This, on top of the fact that you deal reduced damage to anywhere that isn't his head, is enough to where you won't really want to fight him anywhere else. The rest of his moveset is also good, with no bad or frustrating attacks to deal with. So I might not like the fact that he's occasionally teleporting away from you, but I think this is done quite well this time. He never teleports all that far away, and you can always see exactly where he's going to appear, so you get a bit of a head start. He'll also shoot and whip his tail at you while you run, so it's not like it's complete idle time. The biggest fault with this fight is that I think it's a massive shame that they decided to add another Astel fight later on in some random dungeon. I think this lessens the impact of this fight and makes it feel less unique, though I guess this is more of a problem with the Elden Ring in general. True Corrupted Monk is another one of those fights that doesn't really do one specific thing well, it's just overall a really solid fight. It has a strong sense of identity, as his animation and lore fits really well. It has smooth methodical movements, very fitting of a monk. True Corrupted Monk is honestly quite hard to rank. If you fight it normally, it's a decently hard fight as it has 3 phases. It's overall a lot of health to go through, even if none of the phases on their own are particularly hard. The thing is, if you know the fight, it's one of the easiest in the entire game. There are just too many ways you can cheese the fight. Well, I call it cheese, but it is fully intended by the devs that you can do it. For example, you can completely skip the second phase by going on the branch on top of the boss and doing a plunging attack, something that isn't very hard to figure out on your own. There's also the questionable choice that you fight another monk literally right before this one. Now, it's not unusual for FromSoft to put a weaker version of a late game boss early in the game, but they don't usually put it right before it. It would have been fine if this was used as the first phase of the fight, but no, it's an entire other fight and subtracts from the one that precedes it. It's just such a shame that so many random decisions take away from what is otherwise a very well done fight. And finally we make it to the end of good tier. Now obviously my entire list is biased, but this placement is more so than the others. I don't actually think that Gwyn's fight is that good. It has a lot of problems, like the fact that he's way too squishy, or the way he's way too aggressive, make it so you have to exploit the AI to even get a heal in. His moveset also has its own problems, like how it's way too easy to parry, or that he has one specific attack that's way too fast it isn't even reasonable to expect the player to dodge. Despite all this, I really like Gwyn's fight. It's a fight that is helped greatly by factors outside of his actual fight. First there's lore. You get to hear a lot about Gwyn throughout the game. He's this massive figure in the lore, pretty much the god of Lordran. He's built up so much throughout the game, but when you finally get to meet him, he's this burned up husk of himself. He's not the man he used to be, just mindlessly attacking you on sight. This is perfectly reflected in his design, really showing you just how much he has fallen and given up for the sake of the Age of Fire. Even if you disagree with the King of the Fire, you understand where he's coming from, and you can't help but respect the man for his effort. And there's obviously his music, probably the best track in the entire game. I genuinely get goosebumps whenever I hear it. No matter how disappointing the actual fight is, I think I'd love this fight because of the foundation FromSoft has laid. Easily one of my favorite last bosses in any game ever. Man, what a banger. So yeah, there you have it. As always, I'll put it up on screen so you can see the entire thing. Sorry this one took a bit longer, but I think this is going to be the trend going forwards. Next up we have the very good tier, and I think this one's going to take a while to complete. We're finally getting to the point where I have a lot to say about the bosses, so each boss will probably be up to 5 minutes long. So I hope you're looking forward to more fleshed out analysis. Anyways, that'll do it for now, and bye.